Joining me on Decent Cities is Analyst Nick Grous from ARK Invest. Welcome, sir.
How you doing? Thank you for having me.
Excited to have you in, analyzing and digging into a lot of cool stuff in the consumer internet space and digital entertainment, and we're going to get a lot of knowledge out of that brain of yours today.
Very excited. I think we're going to have a great conversation.
Well, first, you work for one of the hottest, coolest companies in there, ARK Invest. It's not a huge team, so you actually get a lot of, you get to explore cool things and then spend a lot of money on them if you like what you see. So, what's it like, in your mid-20s coming and working for Kathy?
I mean, I think I have probably one of the best jobs in the world, and I'll give you a little bit of backstory. I've been with the firm almost 4 years, so I've been with them since 2018. I actually started on the trading desk in an associate role, so I had a dual role, working half on research and half on the trading desk. And over the course of my time there, I actually transitioned fully into research, where I'm now in the current position I am, which is working on the next generation internet theme for ARK, specifically within the digital entertainment and consumer internet space. And I think when I talk about that, I'm evaluating the companies that people use on a daily basis, whether it be platforms, gaming, virtual worlds, all of these exciting new platforms in the online realm. I get to analyze that as my job, and to me, it doesn't feel like a job. So it's pretty amazing.
That's cool. And ARK is famous for sharing its research, right? Which that's a whole new kind of weirdness, right? Because the work you're doing is getting put out on the public stage, and right now it's a huge public stage. So what's that like to know that there are going to be so many eyes on everything you produce?
Yeah, I think it's great having that real-time feedback. When I joined and just seeing this collaborative process, both internally and then externally, it was completely unique than what I had witnessed in prior jobs and in hearing from other people who I'm friends with, or just, other colleagues that have friends in the traditional financial world. You don't typically have that type of collaborative research process. And I think it's a very key, development for ARK, and it has been like a core pillar for what we've done, is to have that collaborative research process, because it allows you to move in very real time and iterate on the fly as you're developing themes and ideas around, some of these emerging technologies that have only been around for a decade or less, and to be able to then understand how communities evaluate them in real time, I think it's invaluable. It's really, really important to what we do as a firm.
Yeah, and I would imagine, as you're looking at some of these cutting edge tech, that the people who are actually building these things may reach out and go, hey, I noticed you thought this and that, and that's got to be kind of cool and kind of valuable in your process.
Exactly. I mean, we use Twitter as a primary platform for putting our research out, and I think the connections we've made on that platform because of that approach are incredible. I mean, we've met so many great people in so many great industries because we're willing to put our research out there and also take feedback from that research. We're not going out there and saying like, here it is, this is the end of our research. We're saying, here's the beginning of our research in most cases. Let's talk about it. Let's iterate. Let's see where this, what the community feels when we put out, work. And that's, I think a big credit to Kathy specifically for setting up the firm in the beginning to, appreciate that over time. It's really quite incredible.
Yeah. And that process of that interactive process sounds great on paper, but the volume must get pretty large. So obviously Kathy is in the media constantly, and there's eyes on. And so how do you sort of filter and manage the amount of inbound attention and opinion and just general energy that you get?
Well, I think we have a great, firm structure. We're a very flat organization. There's a lot of, personal responsibility to filter and understand your specific sector. But we also have an amazing marketing team. We have an amazing compliance team, and we're all working together to ensure that, we're speaking with who we need to speak to. We're looking at the research we need to look at. And, it all starts at the top level. And that, one starts with Kathy, but then also our director of research, research, Brett Winton, who is managing all of the analysts from a research perspective, and guiding us towards, the themes that we think are going to be important over the next 10 years. And so, being in that spotlight, it's a double-edged sword, as you say, because, there's a lot of hate and there's a lot of love when you put out research the way that we do. But, being able to balance that is really important, because you have to understand both sides of the equation to really understand how these themes are going to develop over time.
Yeah. And I think that goes back to the culture at ARK, right? It's safe to say it's a pretty warm, safe, where you can do your thing and not have to look over your shoulder all the time and know that the team has your back and Kathy has your back. Is that a fair statement?
Absolutely. I mean, it's a very open. When we talk about collaborative, I mean it in both the sense that we're putting research out for the public, but also internally. It's very collaborative internally. My team and the team I work on, the web team, we're constantly talking with the genome team and the Indu team and seeing where these convergences in the technology stacks are happening, especially within web and crypto. We see convergences every single day, and so being able to meet with other analysts, which is not typical in finance. You don't have the web team speaking with genome to see if there's any overlap in convergence of when they're talking about genomes and what's happening, and we're talking about online platforms. You wouldn't necessarily think that there's going to be a convergence, but oftentimes there is something that is going to meet in the middle, and then there's a brainstorming conversation, and it really does start to open up kind of new doors and new ways of thinking about what may be missed in traditional ways of viewing what we're looking at.
Yeah, that's a great point. Sounds utopian. It's fantastic. All right, so let's dig into a little of the good stuff, right? So we'll start at a basic level. Virtual worlds, they're evolving. From the old go to the store and buy the video game to now heavy onto in-game purchases. So can you just speak at a high level, just sort of the trends of where these types of businesses are going, and then we'll dig in a little deeper.
Yeah, virtual worlds it's a super interesting concept, and I think it's been around, or the idea that these would exist since kind of the dawn of the internet. Like, we've always known we would move towards this, and futurists have theorized it, and gaming companies have always kind of been at the forefront, and I think we're starting to see this iteration of gaming start to take on what you can start to look at and say, these are really impactful virtual worlds. And I think maybe just to start and go back a decade or a decade plus and just understand the transition that we've seen in the gaming space, because I think that's very core to what is happening now and what is happening in the virtual world space. And one, it's been this transition from different business models. So if you look at what was primary a decade ago, it was pay to play. So you paid $60, you received your CD, you went and plugged it into your console at home. Then we moved to free to play, and this proliferated alongside mobile, because mobile looked to change how people monetized, or how video gaming was monetized. And that changed because, one, it would have been very hard to convince consumers at the time that they were going to pay $60 for an app, because even the idea of an app was a new concept. So they needed a way to kind of hook consumers in to mobile gaming. And it was this idea of free to play. And free to play has dominated since kind of the proliferation of mobile. And free to play, it's a misleading word to a certain extent, because it's free to download. It's not free to play for as long as you want. Normally there's back-end monetizations. And this is kind of the first time we started to see, virtual currencies and virtual goods sell at a mass scale. They've always been around, but they were always siloed into games. They were always a part of the game. It was always the secondary monetization. But this is how then, became the primary monetization method, was to sell through virtual goods. And now what we're seeing is this last leg, or this next transition in gaming, which is some people call play to earn, and this is coming on with crypto and others. But we like to look at it as play and earn, because I think the idea of play to earn, it maybe misleads some to think that the entire idea of the game itself is to earn. But this idea that playing and earning can be something, I think is going to be super critical to virtual worlds. Now, as your initial question is, how do we get to these virtual worlds? And it starts with changing how the monetization of games are structured, and then changing consumer behavior. And this is also the other trend that's been happening in gaming, which is leading to these virtual worlds today, is games have gotten so social. They're more social than they've ever been before. Games are being built today with, yes, there's still core gameplay, but the majority of the time spent on them is actually, you could look at as a social in nature. Think of Fortnite, from 2017 to today, they've had, virtual concerts, they've opened up an entire virtual island just for socialization. And we think that's, the next big leg in gaming is this idea of socializing, so social gaming. And then that is going to lead to what we think will be kind of the first iteration of virtual worlds.
Very interesting. So, let's kind of still staying in the traditional way of monetizing games. When I say traditional, meaning we're not going between games and that portability element. So, are the most successful companies the ones that are getting sort of a flat fee and charging all the users, or that are really trying to monetize their heavy users? The people that are really into it and that will spend big bucks versus just trying to get that flat fee. And I assume that to some extent, the logic is that with the $60 price tag, you're capped at what you can earn from them, and maybe that even $7 per user, like Netflix model, you're kind of capped there as well. But how are those two sort of variations playing out?
Yeah, it's really interesting to think about, and we would bucket this in the way that we look at monetization, and what you're talking about is direct monetization. So monetizing the consumer specifically, and there's different ways to do that, as you've pointed out, and then there's indirect monetization. And we'll probably touch on this later, but I think it's important to say up front, direct monetization has been a primary monetization method for as long as the internet has been around, and so is indirect monetization. And you can think of indirect monetization as just advertising. And games do, advertising on top of direct monetization. And then you have, the flat fee, so your monthly subscription, or you can monetize through virtual currency and, a way for you to get access to something, but then you monetize a smaller subset. And typically what we see when you take that approach, where you have something free and then it's, select in to pay, it's actually around 4 to 10% of total users will end up being paying users. And that's pretty typical across not just gaming, but live streaming services that monetize in a similar way. It's a very small subset of users that are actually willing to take that next step and start paying. So I don't know that there's a right or wrong approach. It's just different. And the different approaches, I think, will converge over time. And one, I think it's because you'll have, the portability you spoke of, allowing for this idea of digital ownership and digital assets to proliferate. And that's when you'll really start to see, yes, there'll still be subscriptions to certain styles of games and certain, aspects of the game. But I think the big monetization opportunity is to embed that idea of digital ownership, because that's when you'll start to see consumers recognize the opportunity to spend and the willingness to spend on virtual assets.
Right. And so when the idea of having virtual assets, there's, there are elements to owning things. It's yours, it's portable, which we can get into, but also potentially it's liquid, right? You can sell it. So, that takes us to the extracting value from these worlds. So what do you see will be the trends in, will the value stay, on the platform and be shuffled around in an internal economy, or I'm assuming there'll be growing expectations to be able to pull that value off the platform?
That's a great question. I don't know that I have the answer. I think we have to kind of watch and see how this develops. But I will say, this idea, this core idea around digital ownership is such it's such a big concept, and I don't know that we've even fully grasped it. We've seen it this year because of what's happened in the NFT space and non-fungible that market blew up. I mean, I think it grew to roughly $21 billion in total transaction volume last year, which is just an enormous amount of money to be spent on what is largely niche style of virtual assets. And I think we're only at the tip of the iceberg when you really start to understand that non-fungible tokens embed, or this idea of digital ownership, it's embedding real world characteristics of our economy into the digital realm. And we've never had that capability before. So now you can embed scarcity, supply and demand exists. So you're embedding finite assets into what will ultimately be, and getting back to your question, ultimately be infinite worlds. I think, if we look at what's happening in the gaming space, because I think gaming is going to come back full circle into this idea of digital ownership, you have game engines like Epic's Unreal Engine, and then also Unity, operating essentially as digital world or virtual world builders. You can go on there, you can create a virtual world. And as the cost declines and the cost of those services continue to drop, we're going to see, and as the creation becomes more accessible to creators around the world, we're going to see people adopt and start to build their version of a virtual world. But I think what will persist is this shared data layer, getting back to your point about portability. And so I think we'll see users have their own assets and identity that they carry with them from world to world. And I think what we'll see is something, and this may be kind of pessimistic view, but we'll see kind of this power law distribution in terms of where most people spend their time. So in the same way that Facebook grew to 1 billion users, billion plus, and Instagram, and you have these like handful of very dominant online platforms today, I think in 10, 15 years, we'll have a handful of very dominant virtual worlds that people spend the majority of their time in, even though there's going to be, as many virtual worlds as there were, online platforms over the past 20 years.
Interesting. But either way, so then the problem, the hurdle that will have to be overcome is just how to absorb value in one platform and make it portable to another platform. A couple options there. One are alliances or groups of folks that recognize each other's value, or there's standards. Using an already existing cryptocurrency or something like that as the base layer, and then having some sort of exchange element on it. So that extraction piece, I think, any early indicators legislatively or sort of, obviously we transcend government at this point, right? So it's going to be an interesting thing to deal with governments.
Yeah, I think and we've talked a lot about this internally, like understanding how the U.S. will approach this problem, but then you have to take a step back and understand that this is going to be a global phenomenon. So if governments are going to step in, they're going to have to be somewhat on the same page to really curb this. If this is if it's something they want to curb, or if they'll just kind of let it grow without a hands-off approach. And I think that's hopefully what we'll see. And I think, what we'll then see is the platforms themselves start to self-regulate. And then we'll also see, I think, as you were saying, alliances. In the same way that we have, country by country, NATO and some of these alliances that govern the global world today, we'll see that in the digital world. We'll see virtual worlds team up with each other and say, hey, if you use our virtual world, you're going to get access and you'll get a specialized NFT to use this next new project. And I think we'll start to see that segmentation over time in the same way that, companies buy other platforms today to integrate services. We'll see that at a very large scale within kind of the virtual world realm.
That makes sense. And what kind of goes hand in hand with portability of owned assets is retention of value, right? That's another Web3 sort of philosophical foundation, right? So that almost any world people exist in, it's sort of on one level they're saying I can buy this asset and take it with me, but on another level they're saying, especially as you build more, whenever social things happen, hierarchies happen, right? And that's, in every instance there's influencers and there's leaders and there's an expectation of potentially monetizing that because it happens on so many other platforms, right? So, how deeply ingrained will be the idea that anybody can earn and work, because virtual world is a virtual world, which means virtual professions, virtual, doing virtual things to earn money. How big do you think that will be in the whole scene?
I think it's going to be one of the biggest, if not the biggest, trends and opportunities of the next decade plus, is this idea that when you operate in the virtual realm, the cost to create comes down to almost nothing, right? It compared to what it would cost in the physical world. So if you wanted to build a product, let's say it's you want to start a t-shirt company. There's so many upfront costs that go into building that type of business in the real world. Whereas if you wanted to mint NFTs that operated as virtual t-shirts for avatars in a virtual world, the cost would be probably 90% that of what you would see in the physical world. So anyone is going to have the ability with the right skill set to develop and create in these virtual worlds. So everyone's going to have that opportunity. And once people recognize that, hey, I can make a living here, we've already seen that. And we can go back to Second Life, which is maybe the first virtual world that really started to kind of pick up steam in its own right. People still today make a living in Second Life. There's 50,000 people that populate the Second Life virtual world at any given time. Their community is still doing close to $1 billion in transaction volume a year. And so just understanding that at a mass scale, you can kind of conceptualize the opportunity for everyone in the world. And I think it's going to be one of the most important trends to watch as the proliferation of virtual worlds happen globally.
That's interesting. And this is sort of a ethereal question, I guess, but we talk about the data layer, right, which is potentially a chain that connects value and ownership records and things like that. But as we see in physical societies, there are other services that governments and institutions provide across the board, right? So the legal dispute resolution, right? No matter if you're buying a tomato down on the at the corner market or a big piece of real estate, there's a mechanism for that sort of thing. So when we transcend government, a lot of these services get sort of diluted in their power and their ability to do anything. So, as we talk about alliances with between games and between worlds and things like that, do you see a service layer that starts to creep up and that these worlds would opt into for things like dispute resolution or accounting or any of the sort of things that governments provide in the physical world?
Absolutely. I think, when and maybe just to take a step back and kind of think about, I think what we're broadly speaking about is like this idea of the metaverse, and the term metaverse has been thrown out for VR and AR and it's, misused 90% of the time. But I think, what we're kind of getting at when you talk about this idea of interoperability between virtual worlds, that to us is, what the metaverse will ultimately be. Once you have that ability to have interoperability between these new virtual worlds that are primarily real-time 3D, that's when you get into this kind of next generation of the internet. And so we think that there's going to be, a number of different pillars and core ideas around, this idea around the metaverse. One is virtual worlds. And I think at the service layer, the idea is that you'll have identity validation services. So the ability to verify ownership, and I think public blockchains kind of take out that service because it's just a record of fact as a digital ledger. But I think you'll then have a second layer of validation, kind of like what we see today when OpenSea verifies a new NFT project to make sure, because again, going back to our earlier conversation, the cost to create is so low that when you do have, a successful launch of an NFT today, you'll see many copycats almost overnight. And so you need a centralized provider to operate as an identity validator. And we've seen OpenSea do this. We saw Twitter do this with kind of their verification profile feature. So we're definitely going to see different layers of services built in to regulate how we interact in the digital realm.
Yeah. And given all the examples we've used, it may be that all the elements of the metaverse, the immersion actually comes last, right? A lot of the core elements in interoperability and value transport and community and sort of that comes long before we actually get the things that people want to wear.
Right, and that's a great point, because we've done the research. If people have time to go back to our big ideas in 2021, we've actually kind of looked at the growth and where are we in the cycle for AR and VR, and it's a very big hurdle. We're talking about entirely new compute platforms. You can think of AR as the new mobile compute platform, and VR would be your at-home compute platform. And so to one, convince consumers that they no longer need a mobile device, instead they just have to wear a pair of glasses, is going to be a big step, right? We're only 15 years out from the development of the iPhone. So, understanding that we're still very early in those cycles, and your point is spot on, that the immersion that we as a society kind of put on the idea around the metaverse, I think that is going to be last. We have a lot of the functionality of the metaverse today. It's, we're kind of waiting for this ability to now interact with it in a new and unique way.
Yeah. And I think you even have a stat for UVI, is it?
Yes.
Tell us about that and how far, what's the highest number?
Our UVI figure is our unit of visual immersion. So we like to use Wright's Law at ARK. And so this is understanding cost declines associated with technology as, supply of it continues and demand of it continues to increase. And so we kind of studied and looked at the trajectory of VR on two levels. One, if it was adopted in the same way video game consoles were and are today, so not reaching many billions of users, but only reaching hundreds of millions and maybe a billion users. And then we looked at it if it were to kind of receive smartphone-like adoption, and understanding that if you had that smartphone-like adoption, you could reach what is going to sound crazy coming out of my mouth, but this 100% visual immersion. So you put on a device and you can't distinguish between reality and virtual reality. And I know it sounds crazy to say today, but this is how technology progresses. We continually get better and better and better. And looking at the devices that are available today, or when we did the study, we created a formula to kind of look at what are the key metrics. So understanding pixel density, understanding weight, battery life, all of these different factors that go into a successful headset. And we think we're about 10% the way there, from 10% of visual immersion today. So we have a long way to go, but if you have adoption like the smartphone, we could get to something that you could consider 100% visual immersion by roughly 2030 to 2035, in that range. So the next 15 years, you could see something that would be unbelievable to us today, which is, I think, going back to your question around do you love your job, the fact that I get to think about that and do that research, I think it's amazing.
That's awesome. And it does beg the question, UVI as a stat, what about the other senses?
Right.
And I think I saw Mark Zuckerberg had a sentence. He said that in their research that really even spatial sound, because we're so used to sort of the Zoom environment where you see everybody, but it's just sort of flat. Whereas if you hear sound coming to your right or to your left, even if it's just basic avatars, it actually gives a pretty realistic experience because of that. So any sort of interesting things you've seen with digging into some of the other senses?
I think Meta, formerly known as Facebook, is probably from a research point of view and from what they're able to actually tell us, is probably the furthest along in developing those other senses. They've put out a number of different publications around haptic feedback, how you then embed the other senses into this new computing platform. And I think if we're 10 to 15 years off from 100% visual immersion, we're talking about 50 plus years before we're kind of fully in something that you kind of forget where you are, and you don't know if you're in the real world or the virtual world. Like, we're talking about the Matrix now, right? I don't think we're anywhere close to that, but I'm optimistic that we get to something like that, because I think it would be, one, just really interesting to use as a consumer.
And just a couple sentences on that move. Obviously, the stock's taking a hit at Meta, and he's making a big bet on this happening. To me, it seems like, I'll say, a no-brainer. It's inevitable, and he's always been good about getting in front of things. What do you think about the move to go so big into this future endeavor?
I think if you look back at the last 2+ years, Mark Zuckerberg never really mentioned the metaverse at length until, the quarter that they pivoted in probably one of the most extreme ways any company has ever pivoted to something so big. I think it's great for the industry as a whole. I think it's going to bring awareness, and already has. If you look at the number of times the metaverse has been mentioned since he has talked about it, and since they've changed their name, I think it's great. I think it's going to bring in so many talented people into this space that want to work on this opportunity, that want to work on AR, that want to work on VR, and that want to build these next generation computing platforms. So from that standpoint, I think it's amazing what they're doing, and I think it already has lit a fire under the industry, and it's going to continue, because they're going to continue to spend to build the future that they believe is the right future.
Yeah. And one of the things I've felt, I'm kind of in that, we'll just say, bridge age, right, where anybody, especially if you're a financial advisor and you're sort of a certain age, you're so resistant to crypto and things like that. And it's obvious that these folks built their identity, built their career, built everything they know, and they're at the top of the heap, with this one way of doing things, and now this gets completely disrupted. And so there's still a large contingent of the sort of professional world at the senior level who aren't convinced this is going to happen at all. But whether with legislation happening and it being addressed by the U.S. government, whether you love what they said or what you don't love what they said, that they're saying anything at all is a huge validation, right? And to some extent, that Meta would pivot that hard into this is a validation. And so all of this are just clear indicators that this is coming fast, like fast train, right?
I think, yeah, absolutely. If you look at just what has happened in this past year, and told someone 5 years ago, El Salvador adopted Bitcoin as legal tender. People are spending 38% of their time connected online. No one would believe you, but it's, if hindsight is 2020, it kind of seemed inevitable, especially with what's happened during the pandemic, kind of bringing on so much of, bringing people's awareness to kind of how convenient the digital world really is. It's very obvious in hindsight, but if you told someone 5 years ago, they would have called you crazy and laughed you out of a room. I totally agree with you. The fact that we're even talking about this, having this podcast today, is a sign that this is not going to stop anytime soon, and we're just going to continue to progress towards these technologies.
And I don't think you can overstate how important actually the pandemic was to supercharging this, right? It just basically forced everybody to try this new thing, and they found out they liked it, right?
Right, and I think it also built in habits that people didn't have. And so, a lot of the work that we put into Big Ideas this year was, what if the habits that we developed during the pandemic, so all the time we spent online, all the time we've spent associating and understanding these ideas around digital identity, digital ownership, what if they stay with us? What if they stay with us as the world normalizes? And so, that's the viewpoint we've taken as a firm, is, some of these habits are going to stay with us. We're not going to revert back to services that are less convenient than the digital equivalents. Innovation solves problem. That's a Cathie Wood quote right there, and it is absolutely true. And we saw that time and time again throughout the last 2 years.
That's great. That's good information. Very much enjoyed digging into this with you. Let me finish off maybe by talking about a few of your favorite projects, not from an investment standpoint, just from a cool factor point of view, what are some of the things that you've been looking at lately that you think are great?
Yeah, so I think one, we've touched a lot on virtual worlds. That's kind of been a big overarching theme for us, and really trying to understand how this, how this looks in 5 to 10 years. I would say within that, one area that I'm just blown away with and so excited about is the gaming space in that play and earn area. There have been a number of different games that have come out over the last year and a half, where you're starting to see kind of the beginnings of something new and fun and exciting that brings you in as not only a consumer, but you also feel that you're somewhat of an investor in the game because you own the digital currency, you own the assets that make up this game. And I think once we understand as consumers that when you're buying goods in these games, when you're playing and earning digital currency, you are mixing what has historically been two separate categories, consumption and investment. And now what we're seeing because of public blockchain adoption, because of play and earn type of games, we're starting to see those two categories merge. And I think a lot of interesting stuff is going to come out of that. I'm not exactly sure yet. We may be in a bit of a bubble in terms of NFT spend and some of these ideas, but on the other side of the bubble and the burst is going to come something I think really, really important to the video gaming space, to what we've been talking about, the metaverse, like these core concepts that have kind of proliferated over the last 2 years during COVID are going to stay with us as we kind of continue to push towards more and more digital consumption.
And I think it bears saying that one of the transformational societal elements of that is it gives people a chance to accrue value, especially in unbanked folks in emerging worlds now can jump in and acquire value, earn without interference, and own without interference, and it just gives them so much access to a new way to build a better life than they ever had before.
Absolutely, and I'll give an example. Axie Infinity, one of the most popular play and earn games over the last 2 years. People in Indonesia and Southeast Asia and the Philippines, where it's very popular, have used that game not only to survive throughout the COVID and earn a stable living, but they're also now using that digital currency. There's a great tweet. I'll send it to you after this, but there's a great tweet showing a taxi cab, and there's this laminated picture on the hanging on the back of the seat, and it's the Axie Infinity token next to Ethereum, next to the Philippine currency, next to USD, and the cab in the real world was willing to accept the Axie Infinity SLP token, which just goes to show you that these economies, these digital economies that are starting to emerge are here to stay. For some of them will end up in ruin. A lot of the stuff in the NFT space is going to end up in ruin, but again, out of all of that, there's going to emerge something truly special, and we've identified it as this core concept around digital ownership. Once people recognize the opportunity that you've stated, once people understand that, there's no turning back. There's no turning back.
Perfect words to end on. Nick Grous, very much appreciate your time.
Thank you so much.
See you again soon.